Hello and welcome to our special show World Cup Rewind. We are on episode number 3, but we are talking about the 5th edition of the Cricket World Cup. I'm Nikhil alongside me Rajdeep Sardesai, and just as we spoke in episode number 2, 1987 was a World Cup of a lot of firsts. It was quite a similar story in 1992. Many things that we saw for the very first time. That is something that we'll start our program with. But before that, we are outside the imposing structure that is called the MCG. For the longest time, the biggest cricket ground in the world, until it was overtaken by the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad. So Rajdeep, for that story, let's go.
You know, right at the very outset, the very first of this World Cup was the first World Cup down under. The first World Cup being played between Australia and New Zealand, co-hosting it, and in a way thereby the World Cup really moving well out of England. And the first thing that strikes you when you go to Australia and watch a cricket game, and I watched this World Cup, was the size of the grounds. You know, if you play in Australia, you suddenly realize boundaries are very far away. You can actually run 5 at times. And the Melbourne Cricket Ground is an imposing amphitheatre. You know, when it's full, 80,000, 100,000, it's truly one of the great grounds of the world. And to get the World Cup to the Melbourne Cricket Ground, I think was something long overdue. The Australians deserved to have a World Cup in their country. And it was a tournament where once again, and we'll come to that, the hosts rather flattered to deceive.
That's right. Let's get inside the MCG and tell you what was unique about this 1992 edition. So as Rajdeep mentioned, the first World Cup that happened in the Southern Hemisphere, and it was kind of absolutely apt that this was Kerry Packer country. Remember, a man who kind of revolutionized white ball cricket, the one who came up with this concept of color clothing, cricket being played under the lights. And so it was only apt that that first World Cup that took place in Australia was the first World Cup to feature colored clothing. Majority of the games that were played under the lights. So in the sense, Rajdeep, this was also the start of commercialization of cricket.
You know, Australia was where cricket changed dramatically in the late 1970s. Kerry Packer brings in night cricket, brings in coloured clothing, makes cricket a spectacle. I think the English treated cricket as a tradition. The Australians had realized that this was the age of entertainment. And Packer was the one who did it. 1992, in a way, gave the Australians a chance to showcase how they had transformed cricket to the entire world. And therefore, I think it was a World Cup with a difference in more ways than one, both in the way the cricket was played on the field and the way it was being marketed off the field.
Right, talking about the way cricket was played on the field, plenty of firsts, as I mentioned earlier as well. This was the very first time you had the white balls, and you had 2 new white balls from both ends. That means the ball was swinging, something that fast bowlers weren't used to because they used to play with that red ball before this. The other thing that really stood out was those fielding restrictions. Now you had only 2 fielders inside the ring in the first 15 overs, and that completely changed cricket. Now, most people would remember the likes of Sanat Jayasuriya and Kalu Vidarna, and you know, they credit them for really changing the way the first 15 overs were approached. Not quite, because you need to look at 1992. This fielding restriction ensured that Martin Crowe, a man who was always ahead of his time, came up with the innovation, had a certain Mark Greatbatch open the innings, and he would make use of those fielding restrictions and try and hit over the infield and get a lot of runs.
You're absolutely right, Nikhil. I think Martin Crowe and the New Zealanders were completely ahead of their times in the World Cup, and for the longest time were the team to watch in the World Cup. Completely unexpected because all the attention was on Australia, the big neighbours. But the New Zealanders came up with great innovations. You mentioned Mark Greatbatch, stocky opener hitting over the top in the first 15 overs. And you had Deepak Patel, who was an off-spinner bowling with the new ball. Both these changes meant that New Zealand was the team which was constantly innovating, and therefore was quite simply, to my mind, the team which outperformed compared to many of the other more celebrated teams in that World Cup.
All right, talking about the first, as we said, innovation, that was the thing that we saw in this World Cup. A few other things that we were seeing for the very first time. The format of the World Cup had changed. Now you had 9 teams in a round-robin format where each team played against each other, a bit more fair system, a system that has returned all these years later that we saw in the 2019 World Cup. We'll see it in the 2023 World Cup as well. The best kind of league system that most people thought, and the fairest of them all. The other thing was, this was the World Cup that happened after 5 years. First time that had happened, remember, 87, and then you had it in 92. Before that, there was a 4-year gap, so that was interesting. The first time you saw South Africa feature in a Cricket World Cup. They'd been out of international cricket because of apartheid, and the most important, and that's going to be our talking point next up, is going to be India's campaign, because this was Sachin Tendulkar, the man who would go on to dominate World Cups, his first World Cup. So this is India going into this World Cup, as now a very established limited oversight. Remember, they had won the 83 World Cup. Then, interestingly, in 85, come to Australia, win that Champions of Champions as well, the Benson and Hedges series. So they come in with a reputation. But I think the start of this World Cup was known to all of us, depending on how India did in that series preceding that. It was a long test series that India played, followed by a tri-series.
2 or 3 points from what you said. First of all, I believe, Nikhil, we often focus on 83 World Cup. In my view, just as important in terms of just the cricket we played was 85. To win a World Championship of Cricket in Australia against some very, very good sides on those huge grounds with a team that was a mix of the old and the young. Lakshman Shivaramakrishnan, a spinner with whom again I played under 15, was the most remarkable young talent that you could see. A wicket-keeper in Sadanand Vishwanath. So suddenly in 1985, Mr. Gavaskar as the captain on his last captaincy leg wins you that Champions of Champions, and then Ravi Shastri with his Audi car, which he kept, which he keeps telling us about. You ask Ravi after a couple of drinks, he'll turn to the Audi car again. Remember, long before our players got their little scooties, there was Ravi with his Audi. But 1992, Sachin Tendulkar. To my mind, that was a moment which I will not forget, watching Sachin Tendulkar play on those huge Australian grounds and prove himself. He scored 100 in Perth in a test match, which he rates as probably one of his best hundreds. Scores another 100 in Sydney. So he is in good form in the test series. The problem is the rest of the team. They've lost 4-0. And Australia, when you start losing, can be a very difficult place. I remember interviewing Azharuddin just ahead of the World Cup, and one of the things he said was the team was tired before the World Cup. So you can imagine when the captain of the team is already giving you a signal that the team is feeling tired. They'd lost 4-0, and that, I think, made it a bridge too far to then play a World Cup after a long series. It's something which should never happen. You need those 20-25 days. The Pakistanis had a 20-day training period into the World Cup in Australia. It made them more prepared. I think they were fresher than the Indians.
Yes, it was a very long tour that India had. At that time, maybe the thought process behind that was let India get accustomed to those conditions. India reached their end of November. That's when the first test match starts, and they are given Brisbane as their venue of their first test match. They're absolutely hammered there. Next up is Melbourne. They lose that test match. India have a chance to turn around things in Sydney. In fact, come very close. Just by 2 wickets, they could have won that test match. Maybe from there on, things could have changed. Then unable to do that, again run Australia very close in Adelaide, but eventually then lose by a big margin in Perth as well. Nothing much to write about other than that 100 by Sachin Tendulkar, 100 by Mohammad Azharuddin, the double 100 by Ravi Shastri in Sydney, which allowed India probably to come very close. That wasn't to be. After that, interestingly, India goes on to play a tri-series. They reach the final somehow, but they only win. It's a long tri-series. Each team plays each other 3 times. It's India, Australia and West Indies. India managed to beat West Indies twice, lose to them once. That sends them to the final, but they lose to Australia in the final. So a long series they have before the World Cup. And then the first game, they're up against England, a tough team. Robin Smith, I think, gets 90 odd. They lose that match by 9 runs. From there on, they must have thought, okay, let's kickstart our campaign. Up next was Sri Lanka. That game gets washed out. Then you're up against a team that you've been playing very often. That is Australia. And once again, we were talking about 87 last time, a close game, right? 1 run. once again in Sydney, India, Australia, that game goes down to the wire.
You know, the fact is, we mentioned Sachin Tendulkar's first World Cup, but it was also the great Kapil Dev's last. And there was a sense that Kapil Dev was now really running on reserve energy. This was not the Kapil Dev of 83 and 87. You could sense that. As I said, the team looked tired. Actually, the players who came in just to play the one-day series, like Ajay Jadeja, a young Ajay Jadeja, appeared a lot more enthusiastic, live wire. I remember him running around the boundary line, looking like a one-day cricketer. Unlike many of the older players who had, you know, the Chris Shrikants also, was someone who was at the end of his career. We didn't have enough of young talent waiting to showcase itself. Jabagal Srinath still under the shadow of Kapil Dev. Somehow I think that team was just at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Things could have turned around had India won that Australia game. 237 is what Australia get, batting first. Another thing, and we're going to talk about that rain rule, India are expected to chase 338 to win that game, but then rain comes and then they are supposed to chase the same target. So it's only reduced by 1 run. Instead of 237 that Australia had got, India had to get 236, so reduction of only 1 run, but 3 overs were reduced. So that changes a lot of things. That game, by the way, goes down to the wire. 13 needed of the last over, 2 fours hit by Kiran More. That brings the equation down of 5 needed of 4 balls. You think you'd win from there. India lose 2 wickets. It's Tom Moody bowling the last over. More is out. I think Prabhakar then is run out. Eventually it boils down to with Srinath on strike, Venkatpati Raju is the non-striker. You need 4 needed of that last delivery, and it's Steve Waugh who's fielding on long on, if I'm not mistaken. India managed to run 2. Had they run 3, and many people blame Venkatpati Raju not for running that third, it could have been a tie, but India lose by 1 run. Again, a heartbreaking loss against an opposition that they lost by 1 run to in the previous edition and tied a test match. And from there on, it wasn't easy going for India.
You know, I went to cover that tour for the Times of India, not as necessarily a sports correspondent, but I used to work for the Times of India, and a friend of mine was an Australian who invited me to spend a few weeks with him, watch cricket. And when I told this to the Times of India, they said, you know, why don't you also write for us? So I ended up doing a bit of writing work on my old typewriter while I was staying with an Australian friend. But my memory, interestingly, all these years later, is not so much of the Indian team, but of Indian journalists going to meet Don Bradman. It is the ultimate experience for us. We are in Adelaide. One of our journalists says, look, we've got to go and, I want to go and pay respects to Don Bradman. And he carries a little Ganpati idol. As we reach Don Bradman's house, I say, you know, we haven't got an appointment. He says, chance lete hain. As we reach there, there's an old man sitting in the garden. Guess who it was? Bradman.
Wow.
Our friend walks in, takes the Ganesh idol and simply goes on what you call a Sakshtang Namaskar, goes and prostrates himself. Sir, I have only come to see you. All those years later, from all the cricketing events, and we'll talk about that, what strikes me is that for Indians of my generation and the generation before, Australian cricket was Don Bradman. You know, he was simply the greatest, and to get a chance to see Don Bradman in the flesh, that was a moment to savor. And you know, that to my mind was the highlight of watching that World Cup.
Okay, we're not done talking about India's campaign because he talks about Don Bradman. There was a Don Bradman in the making, Sachin Tendulkar. We've spoken about him. And I think that highlight of India's campaign there was defeating Pakistan. Ever since that match, India have had the wood over Pakistan when it comes to World Cups. Now it's restricted to 50 over World Cups because Pakistan have beaten India in a T20 World Cup. But that sequence of events actually started in 1992, the first time India and Pakistan play against each other. Plenty of moments from that game. It wasn't a high-scoring encounter. India get 216, courtesy 40-odd by Ajay Jadeja at the start, and then a not-out 54 by Sachin Tendulkar. 216, but India managed to defend it.
I remember Tendulkar's batting. You know, I remember meeting the Don and watching the birth of a new Don in a way. But that match will be memorable for what happened between Kiran More and Javed Miandad. Just before the show, I was speaking to Kiran More. You know, the entire incident where Javed Miandad does those frog jumps mimicking Kiran More, and there's a sort of war of words between the two. Apparently, Javed had a back injury.
Yes.
Couldn't really hit the ball, couldn't drive the ball, was only playing sweeps and reverse sweeps and lap sweeps. And there's a lot of abuse, according to Kiran More, between the Indian and Pakistani players in that match, particularly Amir Sohail. And Amir Sohail is at the non-striker's end and constantly getting under the skin of Kiran More, who then starts getting under the skin of Javed, saying, can't you hit the ball in front of the wicket? Why are you playing behind? And Javed goes to flick a ball on the leg side, and Kiran More collects it and appeals and starts jumping while he's appealing. That is when Javed loses it.
There's another appeal after that where he tries to run him out while he's in the crease and does it again, jumps again. And that's really what really irks Javed Miandad. One, that as you talk about that catch that he's trying to take, which is not out according to Javed Miandad. And then another stumping that he tries to do and again jumps. So it's happened twice and now Javed Miandad is upset.
But I told Kiran More, you deserve a gold medal for getting under the skin of Javed Miandad. Because for his entire career, Javed Miandad got under the skin of virtually everyone. Yes. There's a famous story of him and Dilip Doshi, the Indian left-arm spinner, in a match in Faisalabad in Pakistan. Javed Miandad, he keeps on saying 283, 283, and you know,
तेरा room number क्या है?
तेरा room number क्या है? तेरा room number क्या है? And this Dilip Doshi gets angry. Why are you saying तेरा room number क्या है? Is it 283? And Javed said, "Nee, next ball that I face, I want to hit you into your room, into the room." So Javed Miandad was this, you know, he was a sort of almost hero come villain. There's a Hindi film where the villain is named Javed Miandad in the 1980s. So this was Javed Miandad hitting that last ball 6 against India, against Sharjah. He's the one player whom Indians would have wanted to teach some kind of a lesson. And by winning that match and that entire sort of episode between More and Miandad, I think that's the one occasion we got one up on Javed.
Okay, so as I said, India got 216 in that game. 173 is all that Pakistan could manage. They were well placed to chase that down. 103 for 2 at one time. Amir Sohail gets 60 odd, but once he's dismissed, the rest of the batting just follows him to the dressing room. Other than Javed Miandad, who got 40 out, but he was the lone warrior. 173 all out. India win that game. But that, as I said, was the highlight for India in the 1992 World Cup. After they win another game versus Zimbabwe, but then go on to lose against the West Indies, against New Zealand and against South Africa, thereby putting paid to any plans that they had of qualifying for the semi-finals. India don't make it to the semi-final. There's disaster back home. Plenty written about how, you know, Azharuddin isn't a great captain. He doesn't think out of the box. Maybe the older players, their time is done, they should go. Why is it that Ravi Shastri was dropped after a slow knock that he played against Australia? So that was the post-mortem that was done of the Indian team after that disastrous performance. But talking about the semi-final, which India did not make it, South Africa, playing their first World Cup, made it to the semi-final. And we'll talk about that. We turn our attention to the semi-final, and this is a semi-final that features a team that are playing their very first Cricket World Cup. South Africa playing the 1992 World Cup. Just to give you a bit of a context, just 4 months ago, there is a meeting of all the cricket boards in Sharjah, and finally a decision is taken to re-allow South Africa into international cricket. Remember, they had a 2-decade-long ban from international cricket because of apartheid. They come back. The first series that they play is against an Indian team. It's a goodwill series, 3 ODI matches. They play against India. Don't really impress that much. They lose that series 2-1. The only game that they win is the final ODI in New Delhi. From there on, the next big tournament that they play is the 1992 World Cup. And boy, do they really arrive at the stage looking like world beaters. Probably the conditions suiting them. They reached the semi-final. Arguably a semi-final they could have won. It was the rain rule that we'll talk about. But let's talk about that team. You know, they were like a breath of fresh air. And suddenly I could see they became the people's favorite.
You know, Nikhil, I have a personal anecdote about that South African team. In my rather ordinary first-class career for Oxford University, you will find a score, 1987, Warwickshire versus Oxford University. Rajdeep Sardesai caught Humpage, wicketkeeper, bowled Alan Donald. Guess what I was trying to do? Alan Donald, early 20s, bowled a bouncer. And I tried to hook him, caught up the glove at the back. And I was not wearing a helmet. As I was leaving, Donald tells me, wear a helmet next time. And I'll never forget that because, you're in college, you think that, it's just another match. Donald was quick. By 92, he was the real deal. One of the great fast bowlers of his times. But along with him came a number of other cricketers that we were hearing about for the first time. Jonty Rhodes, someone who redefined the art of fielding. There's that famous photograph of the 1992 World Cup of Rhodes running out a Pakistani batsman, I think Inzamam diving and breaking the stumps. Hansi Cronje, later on, of course, went out of the game in disgrace, sadly, over match fixing. But he was seen as one of the bright stars of South African cricket. Kepler Wessels had played earlier for Australia, knew Australian conditions, was leading the side. Brian McMillan, as good an all-rounder as you could get at the time. So the South Africans were hungry. They'd come into this World Cup determined to prove that their 2-decade-old absence had not diluted their cricketing skills. So they were a team to watch out for, and with a little bit of luck, they could have won that World Cup.
Talking about luck, here's how the equation was. They needed 22 of 13 deliveries playing against England, a team that had started very well, but many thought that they'd peak a bit early. Here in the semi-final, 22 needed of 13 deliveries, and then the rain comes. It is eventually turned into the first time that scoreboard shows 22 needed of 10, and then in a few seconds it's changed to 22 needed of 1 delivery. And I still remember watching that on television, and there were a lot of boos in the ground as well. Many people, as I said, not just South Africans, people who had started to support them thought that that was unfair. Who knows, 22 of 13 may be looking tough according to those standards. You still could have thought of achieving it, not 22 of 1 delivery. That looked like a farce because McMillan comes and just taps a ball and takes a single.
I was covering that game at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, and David Gower was in the commentary box. We were all in the press box, and he was stunned as well. Because I think no one quite had understood what the rain rule could do to a game till that day. 22 runs of 13 balls today might seem like a canter. In those days was a 50-50 affair because you usually scored 6 or 7 runs and over. But the South Africans had a chance with McMillan on the crease. And even the likes of Gower didn't know how this rule had changed. So I think it was a great wake-up call for cricket, that you need to have a better rain rule.
Okay, so just so that you know, that was a monumental moment in world cricket because from there on, the new Duckworth-Lewis system has come. I know not everyone's a fan of Duckworth-Lewis, but believe you me, after what you saw in the 1992 semi-final, the Duckworth-Lewis system is far better than the system that you had at that time. Interestingly, that system was brought about in the 1992 World Cup, led by a committee. Richie Benaud was heading that committee. Before that, the equation used to be very simple. You used to just follow the net run rate. So whatever the net run rate, if you're chasing 6 and over, and if the game is shortened by let's say 5 overs, then 6 into 5, 30 runs would be reduced. So you would then have to chase based on the net run rate that you were chasing. Very simple. But that also wasn't fair because people thought that, teams that were chasing, they got the luck of the draw, rub of the green. So this is not fair. They came up with another system, and this was the best over system, whereby if the overs were reduced, only the overs in which the team that had bowled in the first innings had given the least amount of runs. So if you had an over that was a maiden, then the first over to be reduced would be a maiden. If another over gave away just 1 run, then just an over with 1 run. So you effectively, if 2 overs were reduced and 2 of your best overs just conceded 1 run, then only 1 run would come down of a target. That was a complicated system, but that's the system they came up with.
It was just a terrible system that desperately needed change. And it's sad that it required a World Cup semi-final to change the rain rules.
Okay, that was the end of the campaign of South Africa. England make it to the final. They're looking like a team that is going to be doing well. Australia, unfortunately, don't have the tournament that they hope for. But there's another team that was almost down and out in Pakistan, but turns it around under the leadership of Imran Khan, reached the final, beating New Zealand, then reaching the final. We'll tell you the story of Pakistan, their first triumph in the World Cup. Okay, we're in the middle of the Melbourne Cricket Ground, and this is where that big final between Pakistan and England happens. But before we reach the final, let's go back to how Pakistan started this World Cup. Now remember, They were having a great time in one-day cricket. They'd won a mini World Cup of sorts in 1989 here in India, beating West Indies in the final. It was called the Nehru Cup at that time. So they were on top of their game. They'd won plenty of tournaments in Sharjah during those times. The only thing that was going against them was their record in Australia and New Zealand. Before this World Cup, they'd played about 23 games in Australia and New Zealand and lost 15. So that wasn't a great record they had. To maybe address that issue, they sent the team 3 weeks in advance. They reached the Australian shores, play a few practice games there, get accustomed to the conditions under the leadership of Imran Khan, a 39-year-old Imran Khan, I might add, who comes back from retirement as a personal mission, wants his country to win the World Cup. So that's how their campaign is starting. It's not a great start though in the campaign, lose to West Indies in that first game by 10 wickets.
This was, in a way, Pakistan's 1983 moment. When they go into the World Cup, they were not the favourites. Why? Imran Khan can't bowl, he's got a shoulder injury. Yes. Javed Miandad, your best batsman, has got a back injury and is generally unhappy with the world. He believes everyone is conspiring against him. They want him out of the team.
He joins them much late.
He joins them later. Waqar Younis, their other star bowler was injured, so could not play that World Cup.
Stress back.
So they come with a few young players. We've never heard of someone called Inzamamul Haq. And when you see him for the first time, you don't think he's a cricketer on the world stage because he has this sort of very languid style of walking to the crease, big built. But it was therefore a Pakistan team which had perhaps seen its best days in that period of the late 1980s. But Imran Khan, what do you say about, Mr. Khan? Because he defined Pakistani cricket through the 80s and this was his last hurrah. This was the moment that he wanted to tell the world, ki, I want to leave this game on a high. And after all those losses in the first few games, there's the famous story of Imran reportedly doing a speech in the dressing room and talking about cornered tigers.
Yep.
The truth I'm told, when I asked Imran this, is that no such speech happened.
There are different...
there are different versions.
Yes.
I mean, the Imran version is I said something like it, yes, but not quite, but I had a T-shirt which spoke about cornered tigers.
Right. So before that, before they get to that game versus Australia, sort of a catalyst for them to go on and perform from there on and win the World Cup. They're in disarray, as Rajdeep points out. Javed Miandad actually comes very late to the party. He's not there. He says he has some sort of problem, doesn't leave Pakistan while the Pakistan team is playing those practice games, comes much later. Waqar Younis at that time was a lethal bowler that everyone was talking about. His late swing, the one that was helping Pakistan win all those tournaments that we're talking about, he's ruled out just before he travels to Australia, but is ruled out just before the World Cup. He's got a chronic back injury, so he goes back. Now that's a major blow to them. In overall things, you have Miandad with an injury. Ijaz Ahmed, their star middle order batsman, by that time has become a bowler. He's bowling medium pace, not getting too many runs. Salim Malik is woefully out of form. They've got a young Amir Sohail doing something. Inzamamul Haq just coming up. So not in great shape right now. Aqib Javed as well, not too many people had a lot of hope. He goes on to have a great World Cup, but at that time you don't expect anything much out of an Aqib Javed. And as things started for them, 10-wicket loss to West Indies. In fact, the first 5 games that they have played, they've won only 1 game. That too comes against Zimbabwe, if I'm not mistaken. There's a loss to India in that time, but there's a crucial break. 74 all out. That could have been end of their campaign against England. Rain comes down, gives them that 1 point. The points are split between the two countries. From there on is that Australia game where reportedly Imran Khan comes wearing that cornered tiger or the tiger T-shirt. He was wearing the T-shirt for sure because we saw him even in the final wearing that. So he's there. I've heard various players talk about it. Aqib Javed says yes, there was this sort of a speech. You've heard few bowlers say no, there was no such speech that happened before the Australia game. But I think they'd reached a situation where metaphorically at least they were the cornered tigers.
Intikhab Alam was the manager of the Pakistan team. He says Imran did make a spirited speech saying that we've got to, we're good enough to win this World Cup. He's not sure whether the word cornered tigers is a reflection of the shirt that he's wearing or whether Imran specifically used those words. And over time, it's become part of Pakistani cricket legend. So if Kapil Dev before the 83 World Cup apparently told the team, "Chalo, Javano, jana hai ground pe," after we were bowled out for 183, Imran reportedly spoke about cornered tigers. Look, Imran Khan was this larger than life figure in Pakistan cricket. You know, he ran the game. He decided, he picked the team. You didn't need selectors, you didn't need anyone else. Imran decided what that Pakistani team was going to do. And you're right, luck turned with that rain-affected game. The rest is history. Yeah. They then just peaked at the right time. And by the time the final comes at Melbourne, they're ready for the final. They were a bit lucky, I'll tell you, in that final. I was watching that game. I was convinced Javed was LBW to Derek Pringle. Derek Pringle is convinced that if there was DRS, there was no DRS in those days, yes, Javed Miandad would have probably been LBW. He goes to score a crucial 50. Couple of catches are dropped of Imran Khan. He scores a 50. He's playing as a batsman. They managed 250 odd, yes, which in those days was a good score, but not necessarily a match-winning score. But then you have a match winner in Wasim Akram. And I think what that World Cup showed is that when you have a couple of match-winning bowlers in particular, you can win a World Cup. Yep. Particularly in Australia, you need match-winning bowlers.
Right. It was no easy path for Pakistan. They win that game versus Australia. After that, go on to win a few more crucial games. They win their last game versus New Zealand, still aren't guaranteed a spot in the semi-final. They have to sit by and watch Australia play West Indies. They needed Australia to beat West Indies, then they qualify for the semi-final. Australia does them that favor, beats West Indies. That's when Pakistan celebrates. Apparently, as the story goes, they go out for a celebratory dinner, and Wasim Akram writes on a piece of paper to a taxi driver, Pakistan is going to win the World Cup, and that's exactly how it pans out. They beat New Zealand in that semi-final, a team that was looking like the favorites at the time, courtesy a young Inzamamul Haq, who apparently on the eve of the game tells Imran Khan that he's not feeling well, he can't play, and Imran says, "I don't care, you're going to play." Plays almost 200 run strike rate, 60 odd he gets in 30 some balls, 200 run sort of a strike rate, which you never saw in those days. Win that semi-final, and Rajdeep just totally narrated the final to you. It was a close game. England could have chased that 250 down, but for that double strike by Wasim Akram. Neil Fairbrother at that time was having a partnership, but he gets Chris Lewis as well as Ian Smith, and then things change.
Nikhil, 2 quick points about the final. Which was in many ways a historic day for Pakistan. Quite apart from what happened on the field is what I will remember off the field. The first is fascinating because the Pakistanis win, and guess who rushes onto the field? Not just the Pakistani players, but at least a couple of Indian journalists, Bengali journalists. Huge competition between the Bengali journalists as to who will get Imran Khan's first soundbite. Interview. This was pre-television era. So you have Lokendra Pratap Sahi, you have Debashish Datta, and you have Gautam Bhattacharya, all of them determined to get Imran first. I don't know who got the interview first. They all claimed they had it, but it was almost delightful to see Indian journalists rushing onto the field to somehow or the other get that first bite of Imran Khan after the victory. The second thing that struck me was Imran himself. That speech that he gave, where he spoke about his cancer hospital, but forgot to actually speak about his teammates. And I asked Imran Khan about this many years later, and he shyly replied, "Yeah, got that wrong." He admitted it, which is rare for Imran to admit mistakes, but that speech in a way was classic Imran Khan. Building a cancer hospital, eventually goes on to become Prime Minister of Pakistan. But I'm not sure Javed Miandad was too happy that his contribution and that of the other teammates had been ignored. But it was a tournament where we had the second subcontinental winner in 3 World Cup tournaments.
Well, that's right. After India did that in 83, 1992, Pakistan's first World Cup. However, the repercussions were very different to what happened in India. In India, it was the start of a new era. That team went on to dominate for many years. For Pakistan, that team disintegrated. That was actually a turning point. Maybe the youngsters then got a chance. That team was never the same after that particular victory. Maybe it had something to do with that speech, for which Imran Khan did receive a lot of criticism. All he spoke about in that final speech was his dedication to that hospital that he was building, which is now a very famous hospital in Pakistan.
But I'll say this, in conclusion, I don't think that Pakistan team could have won without Imran's inspirational leadership. Ben Stokes and what he's trying to do with this English side, which is, I think, just a moderately good side, and trying to make it a very good side, is a bit like what Imran did with a team that was actually on the decline by 1992. To lift it to win the World Cup, you needed an inspirational captain like Imran.
No, indeed. In fact, most players said that. Wasim Akram famously said that, after Imran would speak to the team, he could almost walk in air. He felt, empowered. He felt that he could beat any team. And that's how they played the semi-finals and the finals. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have on this episode. We were looking back at that 1992 World Cup, a World Cup of many firsts, as we've discussed in the last half hour or so. Next up is going to be a second World Cup in the subcontinent, 1996. If Pakistan won that World Cup, there was going to be another Asian team that was going to dominate that World Cup. But for that, you'll have to watch our next episode. You are watching World Cup Rewind.
Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
What a great day for Indian cricket.